Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Story of the Indian Mutiny by Ascott R. Chapter 5, The Cities of Refuge.
Minor disturbances on the outskirts left out of sight, the stress of the storm may now be considered as confined to the region between Delhi and Allahabad, wherein Agra, Kanpur, and Lucknow were still havens of refuge, that, it was to be feared, could not long hold out against the turbulent elements surging around and against them. At Agra, one of the most magnificent cities in India, and the seat of the government of the northwestern provinces, there reigned the liveliest alarm among the large Christian community, though Lieutenant Governor Colvin at first tried to make too light of the danger. When the neighboring stations burst into mutiny, a panic set in, the sepoys were disarmed, and by the end of June the Europeans took refuge within the high red walls of the fort, some mile and a half in circuit, that enclose a strangely mingled maze of buildings, galleries, pavilions, domes, towers, vaults, offices, barracks, arcades, gardens, and lordly halls recalling the Arabian Nights, among them such architectural wonders as the glittering palace of Akbar and the exquisite Pearl Mosque, now turned into a hospital for the nuns. In sight of these monuments of Mughal grandeur, a mile or so up the Jumna, rise the snowy splendors of the Taj, that Sultana's tomb praised by some as the most beautiful work of human hands. And on this side, without the city, were the English homes that must be deserted as insecure. The citadel of Agra now gave quarters to several thousand persons, the number increasing as destitute fugitives came slinking in from the wrecked stations around. There was an English regiment here and a small force of volunteers who, in July, sallied out to meet a sepoy army, but had to retire with some loss. Then the unfortunate refugees found themselves forced helplessly to look on at the burning of their houses without the walls, while thousands of prisoners, released from the jail, spread over the country in their clanking chains. And for a few days, the budmashes and the rabble had their way in the city. No vigorous attempt, however, was made to besiege the fort, and its inmates got off with the half-serious, half-ludicrous hardships of an anxious summer spent in marble halls and crowded palace chambers, where decorations of mosaic, enamel, and colored glass ill made up for the lack of substantial comfort. Poor Colvin, broken down, like so many another leader of that time, by the burden of a charge too heavy for him, and pained by the quarrels and murmurs of the pent-up multitude under his too feeble authority, died in September, yet not till he had seen the motley garrison venturing forth again and beginning to restore order in the districts about. On the whole, the story of Agra was rather a happily prosaic one for a scene of such picturesque historic grandeur. At Meerut also, where the mutiny first broke out, our people got through its further alarms by standing on anxious guard behind their entrenchments, while Dunlop the magistrate, at the news of trouble hurrying back from his holiday in the Himalayas, raised a force of volunteers that by their bold sallies kept the disaffected in awe for some way round. Very different was the case of Lucknow, capital of Oudh, a vast expanse of hovels and palaces, situated on the banks of the Gumti, amid a rich country famed as the Garden of India. With its straggling suburbs, it covered a space 6 miles long and about half as broad, including groups of stately temples, palaces, and pleasure gardens. The central part of the city was densely populated, and the chief streets offered a lively scene, thronged as they were with natives in the picturesque costumes of all parts of India, with rich palanquins, with stately elephants, and camels in gay caparisons, with gorgeously attired cavaliers and their swaggering attendants. Every man in those days went armed, frays and outrages being too common under the weak tyranny of the lately deposed sovereign. Even beggars demanded charity almost at the point of the sword, and it was a point of prudence as well as of honor for every dignitary to surround himself with a retinue of formidable warriors. Over this swarm of dangerous elements, Sir Henry Lawrence now held rule, worthy brother of the Punjab administrator. There were 4 Lawrence brothers, who all manfully played parts in the mutiny. Among them, Henry seems to have been the most lovable, distinguished as a philanthropist, not less than as a statesman and a soldier. The institutions which he founded for the education of soldiers' children in India still attest his benevolence towards his own people. He had singular sympathy with and knowledge of the natives. Yet there was no sentimentalism in his earnest desire for their welfare, and when the time came for stern repression, he would not shrink from the uncongenial task. On the earliest disturbances, he telegraphed to Calcutta asking to be invested with full powers to deal with them. Then, prematurely aged as he was by hard work and sickness, strained every nerve to meet the emergency, which seems to have taken him not so much by surprise as in the case of other high officers. Discontent was strong in the newly annexed kingdom of Oudh, and already had Lawrence had to quell an attempt at mutiny caused by the greased cartridges before the native troops raised the standard of rebellion at Delhi. Foreboding the worst from the news of what had happened on the Jumna, he exerted himself to calm and conciliate the sepoys at Lucknow, and for a time succeeded in preserving an appearance of order, under which, however, the signs of mischief brewing did not escape his watchful eye. The residency, his palatial quarters, with the public offices and houses about it, stood upon a slight rising ground near the river, overlooking the greater part of the city. From the first, Lawrence began to turn this position into a fort of refuge, storing here guns, ammunition, and supplies, as also in the Muchi Bawoon, an imposing native fortress not far off. For garrison, part of the 32nd Regiment, the only English troops he had, were moved in from their cantonments outside, and the Christian population soon abandoned their homes for the asylum of the residency. Yet, at this time, it was in no state for serious defense. Even weeks later, few foresaw the hot siege it would undergo. Before long, there appeared cause for actively pushing on the work. Early in May, there was a mutinous demonstration that luckily could be appeased without bloodshed, but it too plainly showed the temper of the sepoys. By the end of the month, the women and children were all ordered in from the cantonments. Business was now at a standstill, and English people venturing into the streets met everywhere with scared as well as scowling faces, many of the better class fearing to lose the safety of our government, while the turbulent elements of the population eagerly awaited the signal for general lawlessness. Sir Henry Lawrence has been blamed because, like other leaders on whom rested the same responsibility, he delayed to disarm the sepoy regiments at Lucknow, fearing chiefly to bring about the mutiny of others who, at various points in Oudh, still openly obeyed their officers. Holding to his policy of pretended confidence, on May 30th, he was warned that a general mutiny would break out at evening gunfire. He went to dine in the cantonments, as if no danger were to be feared, and at the report of the 9 o'clock gun, he remarked with a smile to his informant, "Your friends are not punctual." But scarcely were the words out of his mouth than a crackle of musketry came from the lines. Calmly ordering his native guard to load, though for all he knew it might be to shoot him on the spot, Lawrence hastened to overawe their mutinous comrades. Only one whole regiment had broken out, most of whose officers had time to escape with their lives. The sepoys, however, shot their brigadier as he tried to recall them to obedience, and 2 other Englishmen were murdered, one a young cornet of 17 lying sick in his bungalow. For this small bloodshed, the mutineers consoled themselves by burning and plundering the abandoned bungalows, till Lawrence came upon them at the head of an English detachment, before whom they soon took to flight, yet not till the firing and glare had spread wide alarm among the Europeans. Of the 2 other sepoy regiments, some 500 or 600 men fell in under their officers' orders. The rest kept out of the way, or went off to the mutineers. Next morning, Lawrence followed them on to the racecourse, where they had retreated, and they fled afresh from the English artillery, though not till the fugitive sepoys had been joined by the greater part of a cavalry regiment, for want of whom effectual pursuit could not be made. In the course of the day, there was an abortive mob rising within the city, easily put down by the native police, a number of insurgents being captured and executed. The English leaders tried to encourage themselves by the thought that this long-dreaded mine had gone off with so little mischief, and that now at least they knew their friends from their enemies. But they did not foresee how fast would spread the madness which in so many cases suddenly affected bodies hitherto faithful even against their own comrades. A few days later, the police also mutinied and made off, pursued by artillery, and a force of volunteer cavalry hastily raised among the Europeans. Still a few hundred sepoys, who had stuck to their colors, were stationed beside English soldiers at the Residency and the Muchi Bawun, and, on an appeal to their loyalty, a considerable number of old native pensioners, some of them blind and crippled, presented themselves to stand by the government whose salt they had eaten so long. Among the reminiscences of that trying time, young readers will be especially interested in those of Mr. E.H. Hilton, an Eurasian gentleman still living in Lucknow, to show with pride the carbine he bore as a schoolboy through the siege, and to say, "Quaeque ipse miserrima vidi," if he remember as much from school books, which may well have been driven out of his head by the experiences of his last days at school. Mr. Hilton, then well on in his teens, was in 1857 one of the senior boys of the Martiniere College, at which his parents held the posts of sergeant superintendent and matron. This institution, also known as Constantia House, from the motto Labor et Constantia inscribed on its front, is one of the lions of Lucknow. Founded at the beginning of our century by General Claude Martin, a French soldier of fortune, it has given a good education to thousands of European and half-caste boys, nor is this the only educational endowment due to his munificence. The Martiniere, as it is commonly called, a huge, fantastic, straggling mansion in a pleasant park some mile or two out of the city, was the founder's residence during his lifetime, and afterwards his monument and tomb, for he had himself buried in a vault below the spacious halls and dormitories, now alive with the lads whom that singular Frenchman had at heart to educate in the English language and religion. At the time of the mutiny, there were 65 resident pupils who had naturally to share the forebodings and alarms of that terrible spring. When all the other Christians stood on their guard, Mr. Schilling, principal of the Martiniere, prepared to defend his charge against any sudden attack. A small party, first of sepoys, and when they could no longer be trusted, of English soldiers, was stationed at the college. The elder boys were armed with muskets or carbines. Stores of food and water were collected. And Mr. Hilton tells us how the first taste his schoolfellows had of the trials of the mutiny was the frequent bursting of earthen water jars, which drenched the boys in the dormitory below. The center of the building was barricaded with bricks, sandbags, boxes of old books and crockery, anything that could be turned to account. The boys still did their schoolwork in the long, open wings, but with orders to make for the center, thus turned into a citadel, as soon as the alarm bell rang. One boy always stood on the lookout, and as may be supposed, there were several false alarms when a troop of grass-cutters' ponies, or the dark edge of a dust storm, was taken by the nervous young sentinels for an advancing army. These lads were, indeed, in an exposed position, where they could not long hope to hold out against soldiers, but might have beaten off a sudden attack from the rabble of Lucknow. When the bungalows were burned, young Hilton had nearly seen too much of that night's work. He had gone, as usual, in charge of a party of his schoolfellows who acted as choir boys of the English church, riding to and fro, it seems, upon nothing less than elephants. We were in the midst of chanting the Magnificat when suddenly the bugles sounded the alarm. All the officers present quietly rose up and marched out, and after finishing the Magnificat, the service was then suddenly brought to a close. The Reverend Mr. Polehampton took the choir boys to his house and gave us the choice of remaining there or proceeding to the Martiniere at once. As our elephants were waiting ready, I preferred to take the boys home, and we 12 set off on our moonlight journey of about 6 miles. Near the Iron Bridge, we passed a regiment of sepoys marching with fixed bayonets, but to our great relief, they took no notice of us whatever. At the Huzratgun Gate, opposite what is now Adulji's shop, a sowar, with his sword drawn, rode up and ordered our mahout to stop. Seeing, however, that his horse would not come near our elephant, I told the mahout to go on. After a little colloquial abuse between the two, the mahout went on. The obstructive sowar took his departure with a few farewell flourishes of his naked sword, and we arrived at the Martiniere without further molestation. There we found every one on the top of the building looking at the far-off flames of the burning bungalows in the cantonments, and we received the hearty congratulations of all on what they considered our providential escape. After the mutiny of the police, a flying skirmish took place in view of the Martiniere, eagerly watched by the pupils, who were eager to join in the fray but had to remain on guard over their buildings. Their principal made a narrow escape, meeting the rebels as he drove through the college park and getting away from them by the speed of his horse. There is another story, perhaps a distorted version of the same, that one of the teachers did fall into the hands of some stragglers who seemed inclined to shoot him, but contemptuously let him go as only a schoolmaster. These schoolmasters, and some of the schoolboys too, were to play the warrior before long. Next morning, Mr. Schilling was ordered to abandon the college and move his boys into the residency. A party of the 32nd leading the way, and the elder lads with their muskets bringing up the rear, they marched through the streets lined with sullen faces, where several natives were seen going armed, but no one offered them any opposition. At the residency, they were quartered uncomfortably enough in the house of a native banker within the lines, and there went on with their lessons as best they could for 2 or 3 weeks longer. All our people had now to take shelter behind the still imperfect defenses. Large stores of food, fodder, and fire had been laid in. Fortunately, there were wells of good water within the residency entrenchment. Gunpowder and treasure were buried underground for safety. Much against his will, Lawrence gave orders for demolishing the houses around that might afford cover to assailants, but, ever anxious to spare the feelings of the natives, he desired that their holy places should be left untouched, so that the adjacent mosques remained to be used as works for the besiegers. The preparations, within and without, of the garrison were far from complete by the end of June, when cholera and smallpox appeared among them, to add to the gloom of their prospects. The buildings about the residency were now crowded with people, not only the whole English population of Lucknow, but refugees from outstations who kept coming in for their lives. The worst tidings reached them from all hands. No sign of help cleared the threatening horizon. It was still open to Lawrence to abandon the city, retreating under protection of his one European regiment and his guns. But he took the boldest for the best policy, and kept the British flag floating over its capital when all the rest of Oud was in unrestrained rebellion. He even judged himself strong enough, or was unluckily persuaded, to strike a blow outside his defenses. Hearing that the vanguard of a sepoy army had reached Chinhut, a few miles from Lucknow, on the last day of June, he marched out against them with some 700 men, hoping to scatter the mutineers before they could enter the city. But, unexpectedly, he found himself assailed by overwhelming numbers, for he had been deceived through false information, and it was a whole army, not their mere advance guard, with which he had to do. The European soldiers could not long hold out under a burning sun when the native cavalry and gunners either fled or went over to the enemy. The retreat became a shameful rout. The broken band was almost surrounded, and owed its escape to the gallant charge made by a handful of mounted volunteers, most of whom here saw their first battle. The water carriers, such indispensable attendants in this climate, having deserted, our men suffered agonies from thirst, and many more might have perished if the inhabitants had not come out to offer them water, showing that we had still some friends left. But as Lawrence galloped on, heavy-hearted, to break the bad news to those left behind in the residency, already he found the native population in hasty flight, and soon an ominous silence made the streets outside our entrenchments like a city of the dead. It grew lively enough later in the day when the victorious sepoys came pouring in, and then began the long misery of the defense of Lucknow. But that renowned episode shall be treated of in a chapter apart. For the present we pass on to Cawnpore, where another wretched crowd were already undergoing the horrors of a siege and had earnestly begged from Lucknow the help it could not spare. Their sufferings and fate should be fully told, as an epitome of the mutiny's most painful features. Cawnpore, though no such splendid historic city as Delhi or Lucknow, was an important military station, with a force of some 300 English soldiers, counting officers and invalids, to 10 times as many sepoys. At Bithor, about 12 miles up the Ganges, was the palace of that wily and cruel Hindu, who, under the title of Nana Sahib, became so widely known as the villain of a great tragedy. Adopted son of the dethroned Maratha potentate entitled the Peshwa, and left a rich man by inheriting his wealth, he had a grievance against our government in its refusal to continue to him the ample pension paid to the late Peshwa, whose heir by adoption, by foul play if all stories are true, was, however, recognized as Maharaja of Bithur, and allowed to keep up a sumptuous court among some hundreds of idle and insolent retainers. To ventilate his wrongs, Nana Sahib sent to England a confidential agent named Azimullah, a low-born adventurer like himself, who by dint of shrewdness and impudence made an extraordinary impression on London society. This part of his career reads like a comic romance, and seems indeed to have suggested to Thackeray the Rumman Lal of the Newcomes. But, though petted and flattered by English fine ladies, Azimullah could get no satisfaction from men in office, then returned to his employer during the Crimean War with a report that England was likely to be humbled by Russia. The Nana dissembled his resentment and appeared to have given himself up to a life of pleasure, in which degrading Oriental sensualities were strangely mixed with an affectation of European tastes. Yet, while pretending friendship with the English and leading them to think him a good-natured, jovial fellow whose main ambition was to cultivate their society, this dissembler, it seems, secretly nursed the blackest hatred against his neighbors and frequent guests, biding a time when he might satisfy the grudge he bore against their race. That startling news from Meerut had found our people at Cawnpore engaged in the tedious round of duty and the languid efforts to kill time, which make the life of Anglo-Indians not lucky enough to get away for the hot weather to bracing hill stations. Henceforth, they could not complain of any want of excitement. They had plenty of time for preparation to meet the danger. For 3 weeks passed before it was upon them. The general in command here, Sir Hugh Wheeler, was an Indian veteran of the older school who could speak to the sepoys in their own language, and like some other officers of his generation, had become so much one of themselves as to marry a native woman. Such a man would naturally be slow to believe his children, babalog the affectionate word was, that came now to be used rather in scornful irony, capable of being untrue to their salt. Yet when the demeanor of the sepoys, agitated as much by fear and unreasoning excitement, perhaps, as by deliberate intention to revolt, became too plainly threatening, while still expressing confidence, Wheeler ordered an entrenchment to be thrown up and provided with stores, as a refuge for the Europeans in case of need. So great was his trust in the Maharaja of Bithur that he did not doubt to accept the Nana's assistance. A detachment of his ragamuffin troops was actually put in charge of the treasury, and there was some talk of the ladies and children being placed for safety in the palace of this traitor, already plotting their ruin. Every night now they slept within the entrenchment, but the officers of sepoy regiments had to show true courage by staying among their men, who were not so much impressed by this forced show of confidence as by the distrust of them evident in the preparations for defense. At length, even Sir Hugh began to take a gloomy view of the situation. Many of those under him had done so from the first, and most pathetic it is to read the letters written by some English people to their friends at home by the last mail that got down to Calcutta, farewell messages of men and women who felt how any hour now they might be called on to face death. Before long, the roads were all stopped, the telegraph wires were cut, and almost the only news that reached this blockaded garrison of what went on around them was the grim hint conveyed by white corpses floating down the sacred river like an offering to cruel Hindu gods. On the night of June 4th came the long-expected outbreak. Part of the sepoys gave themselves up to the usual outrages, breaking open the jail, plundering the treasury and the magazine. The rest remained quiet for a time, and one regiment was even falling in upon the Maidan to obey its officers, when, with ill-starred haste, Sir Hugh Wheeler had them fired on from the entrenchment, at which they ran away to join the mutineers. About 80, however, were found obstinately faithful. More than one of the native officers also risked his life in trying to restrain his men, but others sided with the revolt, among them a subadar named Tika Singh, who became its general, the Nana Sahib being adopted as a figurehead. He at once consented to lead them to Delhi, and the whole disorderly crew had marched off on the road, when his crafty counselor, Azimullah, is understood to have persuaded him that instead of going to swell the triumph of a Moslem king, it would be more to his glory and profit to exterminate the English at Cawnpore and set up a Brahmin power of his own. The Nana, in turn, won over the sepoys to this view, and next morning they marched back upon the entrenchment at Cawnpore. The English here had been fondly hoping the danger past with the running away of their sepoys, and congratulated themselves that, no longer tied by duty, they would now be able to make their escape down the river. What was their consternation when that trusted friend of theirs unmasked himself by sending in to General Wheeler a note bidding him to expect an immediate attack. At hasty notice, they fled within the entrenchment, some just in time. Others, lingering or trusting to concealment, were butchered by the desperadoes, who soon filled the streets to make themselves a terror to respectable natives as well as to Europeans. The strength of the disorder here was among the Hindus, at whose hands the Mohammedans were like to come ill off, and if they had not been united by a common hatred, they would probably before long have taken to cutting one another's throats. After spending the forenoon in pillage, murder, and arson, the rebel army came forward to the bombardment of that weak entrenchment, which was to endure a siege seldom surpassed for misery and disaster. Sir Hugh Wheeler is judged to have made a fatal mistake in not possessing himself of the magazine, a strong position, which with all its contents, he abandoned, rather than irritate the sepoys by taking it out of their hands, and thus perhaps drive them into revolt. He seems not to have reckoned on any serious attack. The fortress he had provided was the buildings of a hospital and some unfinished barracks, surrounded by a low mud wall, standing out in the open plain, and commanded on all sides by substantial edifices at a few hundred yards' distance to give cover for the besiegers, who soon surrounded it with batteries of our own heavy guns, while the defenders had mounted only a few 9-pounders. Within such slight defenses were huddled some 1,000 Christian souls, 400 of them fighting men. They had plenty of muskets and rifles, but sorely needed every other means of defense. For now broke over these poor people a storm of cannonballs and bullets, pouring upon them all day like the slaughtering rays of the sun overhead, and hardly ceasing by night, when they must steal forth in wary silence to hide away their dead. At first, every crashing shot called forth shrieks of alarm from the women and children, but soon they grew too well accustomed to the deadly din. In 2 or 3 days, all the buildings which gave them shelter were riddled through and through. There was no part of the enclosure where flying missiles and falling brickwork did not work havoc, as well as upon the thin circle of defenders exposing themselves behind the wretched walls. By the end of a week, all the artillerymen had been killed or wounded beside their ill-protected guns. But the sick, too, were put out of pain in whatever corners they might be laid. Children fell dead at play, their mothers in nursing them. One shot struck down husband, wife, and child at once. Another carried off the head of General Wheeler's sick son before the eyes of his horrified family. 2 men and 7 women were the victims of a single shell. An important outwork was the unfinished barrack, garrisoned by less than a score of men, few of whom ever left that post unhurt. Yet all did their duty as manfully as if not robbed by continual alarms of their nightly rest, with brave hearts tormented night and day by fear for their patient dear ones. Foremost among so many heroes was Captain Moore of the 32nd, who seems to have been looked on as the soul of the defense, ever present at the sorest need, and never seen but to leave men something more courageous and women something less unhappy. We recognize another great heart of a different order in Mr. Moncrief, the chaplain, unsparing of himself to cheer the living and soothe the dying with words to which none now could listen in careless ease. Few and short, indeed, were the prayers which that Christian flock could make over their dead, stealthily buried by night in an empty well without the rampart. Another well within proved more perilous than that of Bethlehem, from which David longed to drink. This was the garrison's one supply of water, and the ruthless enemy trained guns upon it, firing even by night as soon as they heard the creaking of the tackle. When the Hindu water carriers had all been killed or scared away, soldiers were paid several rupees for every pail they drew at the risk of their lives. A brave civilian named McKillop, declaring himself no fighting man, undertook this post of honor, held only for a few days. In the heat of June on that dusty plain, no fainting woman or crying child could have a drink of water, but at the price of blood. Washing was out of the question, a severe hardship in such a climate. Water was not the sole want of our country people, to many of whom the Indian summer had hitherto seemed scarcely endurable through the help of ice, effervescing beverages, apartments darkened and artificially cooled. After a week, the thatched roof of their largest building was set on fire by night, its helpless inmates hardly saved amid a shower of bullets poured on the space lit up by the flames. With this was destroyed the store of drugs and surgical instruments, so that little henceforth could be done for the sick and wounded. Another time the woodwork of a gun kindled close to the store of ammunition. Then young Lieutenant Delafosse, exposing himself to the cannon turned upon this perilous spot, lay down beneath the blazing carriage, tore out the fire, and stifled it with earth before it could spread. Many of that crowd had now to lie in the open air, or in what holes and corners they could find for shade, exposed to the sun and threatened by the approach of the rainy season. A plague of flies made not the least of the sufferings by which some were driven mad. They found the stench of dead animals almost intolerable. Their provisions soon began to run short. They were put on scanty rations of bad flour and split peas. Now and then, sympathizing or calculating townsfolk managed to smuggle to them by night a basket of bread or some bottles of milk, but such godsends would not go far among so many. A mongrel dog, a stray horse, a vagrant sacred bull venturing near the entrenchment was sure to fall a welcome prey. But no expedient could do more than stave off the starvation close at hand for them. Worst of all, the ammunition was not inexhaustible. Such balls as they had would no longer fit the worn-out guns. Then the ladies offered their stockings to be filled with shot. But guns failed before cartridges. At length there were only 2 left serviceable, when a quarter of the defenders had perished, and still the foe rained death all around the frail refuge, of which one who saw it a few weeks later says, "I could not have believed that any human beings could have stood out for one day in such a place. The walls, inside and out, were riddled with shot. You could hardly put your hand on a clear spot. The ditch and wall, it is absurd to call it a fortification. Any child could have jumped over, and yet behind these for 3 weeks the little force held their own." This is the report of Lady Inglis, herself fresh from the perils of Lucknow, which she judged slight in proportion. Several times dashing sorties were made to silence the most troublesome batteries, or drive away the marksmen who swarmed like rats in adjacent buildings. Thrice the enemy emboldened themselves to an assault, which was easily repulsed, though under the shelter of cotton bales, pushed before them, a number of sepoys contrived to advance close up to the entrenchment. They were better served by their spies, who let them know how losses and starvation must soon give the garrison into their hands without any cost of onslaught. One after another of our men stole out in disguise, vainly commissioned to seek help from Allahabad. Most of these emissaries were caught and ill-treated. More than one native messenger did get through to Lucknow, but with a sore heart, Sir Henry Lawrence had to deny the appeal of his beleaguered countrymen, knowing by this time that it was all he could do to hold his own. The only reinforcement that reached Cawnpore was one young officer, who came galloping through the fire of the enemy and leaped the wall to bring the news how his comrades had failed to make the same lucky escape. Other fugitives, seeking this poor place of refuge, were murdered on the way. Meanwhile, the ranks of the besiegers were daily swollen by all the scoundrelism of the district, and by the followers of rebellious chiefs eager to avenge the wrongs of their subjection to British rule. Yet with them also things went not so smoothly as at first. The booty, over which they were apt to quarrel, began to be exhausted. The sepoys could hardly be brought to face the wall of fire that ever girdled their desperate victims. The dissensions among rival believers grew strong. Their leader, jealous and suspicious of the increasing power of the Moslem party, was impatient to seal his authority in the blood of those stubborn Christians. Force failing so long, he fell back on treachery. When the siege had lasted 3 weeks, the garrison received a grandiloquent summons from Nana Sahib, proposing surrender on condition of receiving a safe passage to Allahabad. General Wheeler was inclined to scorn this offer, but Moore and others, who had well earned the right to advise prudence, urged that no chivalrous pride should prevent them considering the inevitable fate of so many non-combatants. Their provisions were almost at an end. Trust in such an enemy might be doubtful, but it was the one hope of life for the women and children if no relief came. And whence could it come? Had they only themselves to care for, these officers might have cut a way through their mutinous sepoys. As it was, they stooped to negotiate, and on June 26th agreed to deliver up their battered works and guns, the Nana consenting that they should march out under arms, and promising means of conveyance and victuals to carry them down the river. The only difficulty was a demand on his part to take possession the same night. But when the English plenipotentiaries threatened to blow up their magazine, he gave in to let them wait till next morning. Through the night, he was busy with his cruel counselors, and to one named Tantia Topi, afterwards better known as a rebel general, he committed the execution of the blackest plot in this dark history. That night, our country people slept their first quiet sleep for long, which to most of them was to be their last on earth. To some, this strange stillness seemed disquieting after the din of 3 dreadful weeks. Early in the morning, gathering up what valuables and relics of the terrible sojourn could be borne away, they left their ruined abode with mingled emotions, on litters, carriages, and elephants, or marching warily in front and rear of the long train, were escorted down to the river by soldiers, now the Nanas, lately their own, amid a vast crowd of half-scowling, half-wondering natives. The Ghaut, or landing steps, lay nearly a mile off, approached through the dry bed of a torrent lined at its mouth with houses and timber. About this hollow way, Tantia Topi had concealed hundreds of men and several guns. As soon as the head of that slow procession reached the riverside, a bugle sounded. A line of sepoys closed the head of the ravine to cut off retreat, and from every point of cover there broke forth a murderous roar as thousands of balls and bullets were hailed upon the entrapped crowd below. The embarkation had already begun. The foremost of the English had laid their arms in the boats and taken off their coats to the work. The wounded and children were being lifted on board and placed under the thatched roofs of these clumsy vessels. But at that signal, the boatmen had all deserted after setting the thatch on fire, and some unhappy creatures were burned to death, while others plunged into the water, vainly seeking escape from the balls splashing around them. On land, also a fearful slaughter was going on. Some of the Englishmen tried to return the fire. Some labored to push off the boats, which had purposely been stuck fast in the sand. Only 3 were launched, one of which drifted across to the opposite bank, and there fell into the hands of another band of slaughterers. The second appears to have made a little way down the river before being disabled by a round shot. The third got off clear, floating along the sluggish current, a target for ambushed cannon and musketry, through which swam several brave men, some to sink beneath the reddened stream, some to reach that sole ark of deliverance. The rest remained at the traitor's mercy. After most of them had been shot down, their false escort of troopers dashed into the water to finish the bloody work, stabbing women and tearing children in pieces. The general was butchered here with his young daughter, unless, as would appear from some accounts, Sir Hugh survived in a dying state on board the escaped boat. Here died the chaplain, beginning a prayer. A whole girls' school and their mistress perished wretchedly. Nearly 500 in all must have fallen on the banks or in that fatal ravine when a messenger arrived from the Nana, ordering to kill the men, but to spare such women and children as still survived. 125, half dead with terror, drenched with mud and blood, were collected from the carnage and brought to Cawnpore. The one boat which had escaped was crowded with about 100 persons, dead and living, including some of the chief heroes of the defense. There is no more thrilling tale in fiction than the adventures of that hopeless crew. They had no oars. Their rudder was soon broken by a shot. Paddling with bits of plank, they slowly drifted down the Ganges, fired at from either bank. More than once they stuck fast in the sand, and at night the women had to be disembarked before the cumbrous craft could be got off. By daylight they had come only a few miles from Cawnpore. Again were they attacked from the bank, and found themselves pursued by a boat filled with armed men. The torrential rains of an Indian summer burst upon them. They were obliged to tear off the thatched roof of the boat, as the enemy had tried to set it on fire. The second night found them helplessly aground, but a hurricane came to their aid, and the boat floated off before morning, only to drift into a backwater. There they grounded once more, and the enemy soon gathered about them in overpowering numbers. Some dozen men, under Lieutenant Mowbray Thompson, waited on shore to beat back the assailants, while the rest made an effort to shove off the boat. This little party, sent out on what seemed a forlorn hope, in the end furnished the only survivors. Their leader was one of 4 who lived to tell the tale. Desperately charging the mob of sepoys and peasants on the bank, they drove them back for some distance, but soon found themselves surrounded by overwhelming numbers. Without the loss of a man, however, though not without wounds, they cut their way back to the shore to find the boat gone. Expecting to catch it up, they pushed on down the stream, but could see nothing of it, and had to shift for themselves as best they could. Spread out in open order to give less mark for bullets, they held together, loading and firing upon the rabble that pressed at their heels, yet not too near, like a cowardly pack of wolves. When the hunted Englishman had toiled some 2 or 3 miles barefoot over rough ground, a temple appeared in the distance, for which the officer shaped his course. Mowbray Thompson himself, in his story of Cawnpore, describes the last stand made here by this remnant of its garrison. I instantly set 4 of the men crouching in the doorway with bayonets fixed, and their muskets so placed as to form a cheval de frise in the narrow entrance. The mob came on helter-skelter, in such maddening haste that some of them fell or were pushed on to the bayonets, and their transfixed bodies made the barrier impassable to the rest, upon whom we, from behind our novel defense, poured shot upon shot into the crowd. The situation was the more favorable to us, in consequence of the temple having been built upon a base of brickwork 3 feet from the ground, and approached by steps on one side. Foiled in their attempts to enter our asylum, they next began to dig at its foundation. But the walls had been well laid, and were not so easily to be moved as they expected. They now fetched faggots, and from the circular construction of the building, they were able to place them right in front of the doorway with impunity, there being no window or loophole in the place through which we could attack them, nor any means of so doing without exposing ourselves to the whole mob at the entrance. In the center of the temple there was an altar for the presentation of gifts to the presiding deity. His shrine, however, had not lately been enriched, or it had more recently been visited by his ministering priests, for there were no gifts upon it. There was, however, in a deep hole in the center of the stone which constituted the altar, a hollow with a pint or 2 of water in it, which, although long since putrid, we bailed out with our hands and sucked down with great avidity. When the pile of faggots had reached the top of the doorway, or nearly so, they set them on fire, expecting to suffocate us, but a strong breeze kindly sent the great body of the smoke away from the interior of the temple. Fearing that the suffocating sultry atmosphere would be soon insupportable, I proposed to the men to sell their lives as dearly as possible. But we stood until the wood had sunk down into a pile of embers, and we began to hope that we might brave out their torture till night. Apparently, the only friend left us would let us get out for food and attempted escape. But their next expedient compelled an evacuation, for they brought bags of gunpowder and threw them upon the red-hot ashes. Delay would have been certain suffocation, so out we rushed. The burning wood terribly marred our bare feet, but it was no time to think of trifles. Jumping the parapet, we were in the thick of the rabble in an instant. We fired a volley and ran amuck with the bayonet. One by one, making for the river, Most of the poor fellows were shot down, some before reaching it, some while swimming for their lives. Most thankful was Mowbray Thompson, now that a year or two before he had spent a guinea on learning to swim at the Holborn Baths. Only he, Lieutenant Delafosse, and 2 Irish privates escaped both the yelling crowd that thronged the bank and not more cruel alligators that lurked here in the blood-stained water. Stripping themselves as they went, they swam on for 2 or 3 hours, the current helping to carry them away till the last of their pursuers dropped off. Then they could venture to rest, up to their necks in water, plunging into the stream again at every sound. At length, utterly exhausted by fatigue and want of food, they saw nothing for it but to let themselves be dragged out by a band of natives whose professions of friendliness they hardly credited, yet found them friends indeed. These 4 sole survivors of our force at Cawnpore were sheltered by a humane Rajah till they could be safe in Havelock's ranks. When you got once more among your countrymen and the whole terrible thing was over, what did you do first? Thompson came to be asked, years afterwards, and his answer was, "Why, I went and reported myself as present and ready for duty." Their less fortunate comrades in the boat, captured after such resistance as could be offered by its famished and fainting crew, had been taken back to Cawnpore. The men were ordered to be shot. One of the officers said a few prayers. They shook hands all round like Englishmen. The sepoys fired and finished the work with their swords. The women had to be dragged away from their husbands before this execution could be done. To the number of about 30, including children, they were added to that band of captives in the Nana's hands, which presently became increased by another party of hapless fugitives from Futtehgur, hoping here at last to find safety after an ordeal of their own, as we have already seen. The fate of these prisoners is too well known. Some 200 in all, they were confined for more than a fortnight within sight of the house where the Nana celebrated his doubtful triumph under the coveted title of Peshwa, which he had now conferred upon himself. In want and woe, ill-fed, attended by sweepers, that degraded caste whose touch is taken for pollution, they had to listen to the revelry of their tyrant's minions, and some were called on to grind corn for him, as if to bring home to them their slavish plight. Still, the worst was delayed. Probably the Nana had once meant to hold them as hostages, but as his affairs grew more disquieting, through the hate of rival pretenders and the defeat of his troops before Havelock, perhaps enraged to fury, perhaps rightly calculating that the British were urged on to such irresistible efforts by the hope of rescuing his captives, he resolved on a crime for which the chief ladies of his own household, the widows of the adopted father to whom he owed everything, heathen as they were, are said to have called shame upon him and threatened to commit suicide if he murdered any more of their sex. The avenging army was now at hand, not to be frightened away by the roar of the idle salutes by which the Nana would fain have persuaded himself and others that he was indeed a mighty conqueror. Before going out to meet it on July 15th, he gave the order which has forever loaded his name with infamy. A few men, still suffered to live among the prisoners, were summoned forth. With them came the biggest of the boys, a lad of 14, fatally ambitious not to be counted among women and children. These were soon disposed of. Soon afterwards, a band of sepoys were sent to fire into the house packed with its mob of helpless inmates, but the mutineers, who had done many a bloody deed, seemed to have shrank from this. Half a dozen of them fired a few harmless shots, taking care to aim at the ceiling. Then were brought up 5 ruthless ruffians, fit for such work, 2 of them butchers by trade. By the quickly gathering gloom of Indian twilight, they entered the shambles, sword in hand, and soon shrieks and entreaties, dying down to groans through the darkness, told how these poor Christians came to an end of their sorrows. Proud, delicate English ladies, dusky Eurasians, sickly children, the night fell upon them all, never to see another sun. One day more, and these unfortunates might have heard the guns of their advancing deliverer. After a succession of arduous combats, toiling through deep slush and sweltering air, Havelock had come within a few miles of Cawnpore, to find Nana Sahib waiting to dispute the passage with more than thrice his own numbers drawn up across the road. Very early in the morning, the British soldiers had been roused from their hungry bivouac in the open air. What their chief had to tell them was how he had heard of women and children still alive in Cawnpore. His clear voice broke into a sob as he cried, "With God's help, men, we shall save them, or every man of us die in the attempt." The men answered with 3 cheers and needed no word of command to set out under the moonlight. The sun rose upon the hottest day they had yet had to struggle through. A march of 16 miles, that in itself was a trying day's work for India, brought them in sight of the enemy. Taken in flank by a careful maneuver, the sepoys were rolled up before the onrush of the Rossshire Buffs, and not now for the first or last time had terror struck to their hearts by the fierce strains of the Highland bagpipe. Twice they rallied, but twice again our men drove them from their guns, to which English and Scots raced forward in eager rivalry. The blowing up of the Cawnpore magazine proclaimed a complete defeat. When night fell, the cowardly tyrant was flying amid his routed troops, and the weary Britons dropped to sleep on the ground they had won, cheered by hopes that the prize of the victory would be the lives of their country folk. It is said that on the night of this Battle of Cawnpore, Havelock himself learned how he had come too late, but in any case, his 1,000 men or less were not fit to be led a step further. Next day, when they entered the deserted city, their ranks began to be saddened by vague rumors of the tragedy they had toiled and bled to avert. But they could not realize the horror of it till some Highlanders, prowling in search of drink or booty, came upon the house where their shoes plashed in blood and the floor was strewn with gory relics, strips of clothing, long locks of hair, babies' shoes and pinafores, torn leaves of paper, all soaked or stained with the same red tokens of what had been done within those walls. The trail of blood led them to a well in the courtyard, filled to the brim with mangled corpses, a sight from which brave men burst away in passionate tears and curses. Over that gruesome spot now stands a richly sculptured monument where emblems of Christian faith and hope seem to speak peace to the souls of the victims buried beneath its silent marble. But who can wonder if, by such an open grave, our maddened soldiers then forgot all teachings of their creed, swearing wild oaths, oaths too well kept, to take vengeance on the heathen that thus made war with helpless women and children. Yet more worthy of our true greatness are the words of one who has eloquently chronicled the atrocities of Cawnpore, to draw from them the lesson that upon their most deep-dyed scenes each Englishman should rather breathe a silent petition for grace to do in his generation some small thing towards the conciliation of races estranged by a terrible memory. Alas, by more than one such memory. Having reached Cawnpore too late, in spite of their utmost exertions, our small army had now before it the greater task of relieving Lucknow, believed to be in the utmost straits. But inevitable delays bridled their impatience. The Nana's troops were still in force not far off. Even far in Havelock's rear, within a day's railway journey from Calcutta, there was an outbreak which had to be put down by the reinforcements hurrying up to his aid. Before we return to the siege of Delhi, a minor episode here should be related as one of the most gallant actions of the mutiny, and yet no more than a characteristic sample of what Englishmen did in those days. On July the 25th, the sepoys at Dinapore mutinied, and though stopped from doing much mischief there by the presence of European troops, managed to get safe away, as at Meerut, through the incapacity of a general unfit for command. Marching some 2,500 strong to Ara, a small station in the neighborhood, they released the prisoners, plundered the treasury, and were joined by a mob of country people, at the head of whom placed himself an influential and discontented nobleman named Kaur Singh. But here the few Europeans were prepared for the trial that now came upon them. The women and children being sent out of danger, a small house belonging to Mr. Wake, the magistrate, had been put in a state of defense and stored with food and ammunition. It was an isolated building of one large room, used as a billiard room, with cellars and arches below, and a flat roof protected by a parapet. Into this, the Englishmen, not 20 in number, betook themselves, with some 50 faithful Sikhs, and almost all the former being sportsmen, if not soldiers. They kept up such a fire as taught the enemy to be very careful how they came too near their little stronghold. The siege, however, was hotly pushed. A rain of balls fell, day and night, on the defenses, behind which, strange to say, only a single man was seriously wounded, though the sepoys fired from a wall not 20 yards off, and from the surrounding trees and the ditch of the compound. 2 small cannon were brought to bear on the house, one from the roof of a bungalow which commanded it. An attempt had first been made to carry it by storm, but the defenders were so active at their loopholes that the assailants did not care to try again. Other means failing, they set fire to a heap of red pepper on the windward side, hoping to smoke out the garrison. A not less serious annoyance was the stench of dead horses shot underneath the walls. But Wake and his brave band held out doggedly and would not listen to any proposal for surrender. Meanwhile, their friends at Dinapore were eager to make an effort for their relief. With some difficulty, the consent of the sluggish general was won, and over 400 men steamed down the Ganges to land at the nearest point to Ara. By bright moonlight, they struck out over the flooded country. But the night march was too hurried and careless. The relieving force, fired on from an ambush, fell into disastrous confusion, turned back, fighting their way into the boats, and got away with the loss of half their number. Yet, in that scene of panic and slaughter, some fugitives so distinguished themselves that 2 Victoria Crosses were earned on the retreat. The besieged soon learned how their hopes of succor had been dashed down and might well have given themselves up to despair. When the siege had lasted a week, it appeared not far from an end. The enemy were found to be running a mine against them. Water had luckily been dug down to under the house, but their food began to fail. Then, looking out on the morning of August 3rd, expecting perhaps to see the sun rise for the last time, to their astonishment, they discovered no one to prevent them from sallying forth and capturing the sheep which had been feeding in the compound under their hungry eyes. The beleaguering sepoys had unaccountably vanished. Help was indeed at hand from another side. Vincent Eyre, a hero of the Afghan war, had been moving to their relief with not 200 men and 3 guns. Though on the way he heard of the repulse of the Dinapore detachment, more than twice his own strength, he did not turn back. Making for an unfinished railway embankment as the best road to Ara, he encountered Kaur Singh's whole force of 2,000 or 3,000 sepoys and an unnumbered rabble, who crowded upon the little band, and must soon have swept them away by the mere weight of bullets. But the Englishmen charged into the thick of the crowd, and this time it was the enemy's turn to fly in dismay. Next day, the garrison of that billiard room joyfully hailed the friends who had thus marvelously relieved them, and it is hard to say which had more right to be proud of their feat of arms. Kaur Singh, beaten away from Ara, nevertheless long held the field, and did his side good service by keeping the country in disorder, that helped to delay the advance of our troops to the fields on which they were so urgently needed. Now has to be recorded a curious trait, very characteristic of Englishmen in India. While Havelock was waiting on the scene of that woeful massacre, till he should be able to advance, with such saddening memories fresh about them, with such deadly trials still before them, the officers kept up their spirits by organizing the Cawnpore Autumn Race Meeting, which their pious general thought right to attend. The fawning or scowling natives, who now were fain at least to make some show of loyalty, must have thought the ways of Englishmen more unaccountable than ever.
This concludes today's reading of The Story of the Indian Mutiny, by Ascott R. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at antonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.